Welcome. The topic for today is Utilitarianism, the Principles of Moral and Legislation by Jeremy Bentham. Of utilitarianism. Bentham espoused the idea of utilitarianism, which defined virtue in terms of utility. The greatest happiness of the greatest number was accepted as the true goal of society. This philosophy had roots in early Greek thought and has been developed in the writing of some of the Bentham's contemporaries also. This idea can be treated basically from three sources. First, the Greek Epicurean. The Greek Epicurean believed that pleasure was the highest and the only intrinsic good. Also, Helvetius, a French philosopher, argued that all of man's faculties can be reduced to physical sensation, self-interest, founded on the love of pleasure and fear of pain is, he argued, the basic guiding principles of man's action. Bentham claimed to have discovered the utilitarian doctrine as a result of his reading Joseph Priestley's essay on the first principles of government, published in the year 1769. The principle of utility, pleasure and pain doctrine. Bentham's introduction to the principles of moral and legislation sets out the doctrines from which he derived his jurisprudential thought. The principle of utility subjects us to two sovereign masters, the pleasure and the pain. This principle, according to Bentham, allows man to approve or disapprove an action according to its tendency to promote or reduce a person's happiness. The sanctions from which pleasure and pain flows are presented in four different forms: physical sanction, political sanctions, moral sanctions, and religious sanctions. Now let us try to understand what is the nature of law according to Bentham. Bentham defined law as an assemblage of signs declared and adopted by sovereign in a state that defines the conduct to be observed in a case by a certain person or a class of persons who are supposed to be subject to the power of the sovereign. The law as command theory. Bentham's idea of law is also called analytical positivism because he saw law as command. This theory views law as the command of a sovereign, a person or a body, or supreme governor. His authority is not infinite, but it must be accepted as indefinite. This indefinite authority, according to Bentham, is only limited by expressed convention. The sanctions of the law rest upon the expectation in which the people should act in a certain events, which acts as the motive upon those whose conduct is in question. Bentham espoused the idea of hedonistic or utility calculus. Bentham argued that it was possible to make a quantitative calculation and comparison of the pleasure and pain likely to occur as the result of course of action. These pleasure and pain would be summed up as to arrive as the good or bad tendency of an act. The individual happiness would then be summed algebraically into the social total, each component being weighted equally. The resulted social total would be identified with the common good of society, which was pursuit of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The principles of legislation. According to Bentham, the science of legislation is the knowledge of good. The art of legislation is the discovery of the means to realize that good, and the foundation of our legislature's reasoning must be the principle of utility. The purpose of legislation. The purpose of legislation, according to Bentham, are the following: to provide sustenance and, where possible, abundance, to provide security. This was the most important goal for legislature and involves the protection of a man's honor, status, and property. Bentham defined property as a basis of expectation of deriving certain advantages from a thing which we are said to possess, in consequence of the relation in which we stand towards it. Liberty, according to Bentham, was not the goal of the legislator, which might be giving way for higher consideration of security. To diminish inequality was the third main purpose of legislation, according to Bentham. The pursuit of perfect equality was a chimera. Equality of opportunity should not be pursued, save where it did not interfere with the security. Bentham's critique of natural law. Bentham rejected natural law as nothing but a phrase. According to him, the promulgation of rights of the nature ought not to be allowed to place any limits as on the concept of political sovereignty and its principle. In the area of criminal law, Bentham advocated for a censorial jurisprudence. A censorial jurisprudence seeks the consideration and investigation of the reason behind a certain punishment to a criminal for a particular act. Bentham bases his investigation and consideration on the principle of utility. The oppositions to Bentham's theory of law. Bentham's idea of law has been opposed by many theorists, jurists, and philosophers. These are the following main opposition to Bentham's theory of law based on utilitarianism. The pleasure and pain doctrine are highly subjective phenomena and it's impractical to measure pleasure and pain. The objective assessment of principle of utility is impossible. Further, the consequence of an action may not result immediately in either pleasure or pain, unless one adheres with the tautological fashion to pleasure as not pain. The relationship between individual and communal happiness is not as direct as Bentham suggested, nor is general happiness always the true happiness of all. Philosopher A.J. Ayer makes the point that it is not self-contradictory to say that some pleasurable things are not good and that some bad things are desired. This paradox goes against the principles of utility as proposed by Bentham. Utilitarianism as the species of natural law. Some critics have also argued that the principle of utilitarianism is nothing but a repacked name of natural law. Bentham objected to natural law doctrine as nonsensical jargon, but suggestions have been made that utilitarianism may have much in common with the outlook of natural law. Utilitarianism is concerned with ultimate value, as is natural law. The principle of utility seems to some jurists to have about it an aura of universal and immutable values. Utilitarianism and natural law are based on normative system with a strong legal slant. Also, utilitarianism is a comprehensive philosophy which embodies a uniform method of analysis as in the case of natural law. Finally, some important point to remember. Bentham is regarded as the true father of analytical school of law. His theory is known by different names, namely the doctrine of hedonism, the theory of pleasure and pain, and the utilitarianism theory. Bentham remained one of the most influential theorists of the 19th century, whose idea inspired many jurists like Austin, Hart, and Kelson. That's Bentham and his theory of utility. See you in the next lesson.